Well, hello, everyone. I am David Tucker, and I'm thrilled to have you here with me for our second episode of Cloud Builder Live. Now, today, we've got something that I believe is an essential tool for anyone that's working within AWS. And the cool thing is that these concepts will transition even if you're working in other platforms. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. But I want to remind you why we're here doing what we're doing, why this series exists from a Cloud Guru and from Pluralsight. And that's fundamentally this. Like, we're here to help you actually build real solutions in the cloud instead of just knowing about cloud services. Because I've talked to a lot of developers that go out, they get their certification, they get this information, but then they come back and they're like, but how do I know that I'm really building things right in the cloud? So this series is here to help walk you through actually building some pretty close to real world solutions and show you how you can apply that on any of the applications that you're going to be creating. And we have a solution today that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the Cloud Development Kit, or CDK, from AWS. Now, before I dive in and talk a bit about why this is such an important concept and why this is something that we're going to be diving into today, I want to cover a core foundational topic that really is going to underpin all of this. So before you dive into the CDK, you need to understand one core concept, and that's going to be this core concept of infrastructure as code. So let me just define this really quick. Infrastructure as code is the methodology of managing your cloud infrastructure in code, which enables you to apply development best practices to your infrastructure. So what this means is that we can now take code, whether that's in templates or programmatic, we'll talk about that in a minute, but you can take some type of code, you can use that to define your infrastructure, and then you can store that in a Git repository, right? You can track changes over time. You can continuously deploy or continuously integrate that with your application. And you might say, well, why is this so critical, right? Well, let's talk about what happens if you don't do this, right? So if you don't do this, probably what will actually happen is that, you'll go through and do a bunch of things manually. So maybe you're going through in the AWS console and you're going to click around to different buttons and you're going to deploy something. Well, that's okay. But what happens when it changes over time? What happens when you need to create a new environment? Do you remember all the steps that you took? And so with infrastructure as code, we say, no, let's take away the manual bits of this and let's use a service that helps us to automate this. So that's what we're going to be looking to do. And one of the ways we do that is with the CDK. But I need to talk a little bit with you about the different ways that we can do infrastructure as code on AWS. So there's really two different camps here, right? We have what we would call the native approach to infrastructure as code. And what really is the center of that is a service called CloudFormation. And then we have the third-party set of tools that relate to infrastructure as code. So let's start over on the native side. As I mentioned, we have CloudFormation, and there's two additional services that actually both really are just connected into CloudFormation. The first is the Serverless Application Model, or SAM. This is another way. This is really focused at building serverless applications. It provides some ways to create these declarative templates in JSON or YAML, the same thing as you would with CloudFormation, but there's some utilities that help you do it quicker and help your local development. But then we have the CDK, which is a completely different thing that enables you to still create those templates, but the way you create them is by writing your own code in TypeScript, JavaScript, .NET, Java, Go, so on and so forth. You've got a bunch of different languages that you can use to create these templates. And that's what we're going to be doing today with a web application that we're going to be deploying out to AWS. So we've got that. Now, you also have the third-party side, and this is where you have solutions like Terraform, which has been around for quite some time and is very popular, and some newer solutions like Pulumi. Now, one of the reasons why you might choose a third-party solution over a native solution is if you want to support multiple clouds. Probably doesn't surprise anybody that for the most part, if you're using an AWS service for infrastructure as code, that's going to be just for AWS. So if you're doing stuff in AWS, that's great. But if you need to branch out, that's where some of those other third-party solutions can shine. I was a part of, early on in my experience with Terraform, I was working on a project that spanned both Azure and AWS, for example. So that's part of the reason why we do that. But let's talk a little bit about the CDK and why we're going to be diving into it. So here, the CDK is an open source software development framework to define your cloud application resources using familiar languages. And that's kind of the AWS official definition. And so one of the great things is that it is open source. You can go through and see all the bits of the CDK. You can contribute to the CDK. You can create your own constructs. We'll talk more about that a little bit later today. But that's really what the value is that you don't have to write those templates. Anything you can do with the programming language, you can do with the CDK to create those templates. Now, some people have some objections to that approach. We'll talk about that a bit later too, so you understand the pros and cons of what you're doing when you're building with the CDK. So with all that said, that's all kind of the introduction, right? This is ultimately about building. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and open up VS Code, and we're going to dive in here. So I've got a project here that has, for the moment, just really a web application. Now, for those of you that joined us last month, as we really took apart how to build an application with AWS Amplify, we're going to be doing something similar here, but it's also going to be different. But some of this will look a little familiar if you joined us for that first episode. And if you didn't, man, I would highly encourage you, go back, take a look at it on YouTube, and just, feel free to interact on Discord if you have any questions on that one, because we covered a ton of ground with AWS Amplify last week. So let me go ahead and run this web application so that you can see what we're actually going to be doing here. So I'm just going to go ahead and change into my web application directory, and then we're going to go ahead and just run yarn start. Now I'm using yarn here instead of actually using NPM, partially because I'm using a mono repo approach. And we'll talk a little bit later as to why in some cases that becomes a good thing to do when you're working with the CDK. But it has a lot to do with the fact that we kind of need to manage multiple repositories here. So here, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this sample application. I'm just going to say upload photo, and I'm going to pick a photo. And what we want to have happen here is that we want to be able to go and get some metadata about this and some AI tags for it. So we're going to have this web application. We're going to have an API that we deploy using API Gateway, and we're going to have all of this packaged together and deployed on AWS using the CDK. And then at the end, I'm going to explain to you how you can utilize a feature of the CDK to implement continuous delivery for this web application and its API utilizing a feature called CDK pipelines. So ultimately, that's what we're going to be working through today. And be sure, again, be queuing up questions here. If you have any questions around, what I'm doing, why I'm doing something the way I'm doing, that is exactly what this series is for. So I hope you're going to be asking questions, and I'll periodically take some breaks as we go through, and I'll be sure to answer any of the questions that come up. So here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to go ahead and open back up VS Code. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to go back here into the terminal for the moment, and we're going to go ahead and cancel out of running this web application. I'm going to change back up here to the root of the root directory here, and we're going to create a directory where we're going to store our CDK code. Now, this is going to be called infrastructure. Now, I'm going to tell you something here. What I'm showing you today is really just a simplified version, just a tiny bit of how I actually build a majority of the AWS applications that I build today. I mentioned last month, there was one I did recently for a client that it just made sense to use Amplify, and we did that. But most everything I build now, I build using this mono repo type structure with the CDK. So I'm really kind of giving you some insight into how I truly build applications on AWS. So the first thing we did here was we created this infrastructure directory. I'm going to go ahead and change into that directory. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install the CDK toolkit. Now, I I should call out here, you're really going to need two things if you're going to go through and do this yourself. The first thing that you're going to need is that you need to have an AWS account, because you're going to need to have those credentials configured. The next thing that you're going to need to do is that you're going to need to have Node.js, even if you're using one of the other programming languages. Now, I see we have a question here. What programming languages are supported by the CDK? That is a great question. So as of right now, what we have is we have TypeScript, which in a lot of ways is really kind of what the CDK is actually built in. We also have support for JavaScript. We also have support for Java and for .NET. We have support for Python, and we have support for Go, which I believe, as of the last time I checked, is still just in preview. So we don't have a final version of that. But the way it works is that the CDK has support within all the different package repositories for each of those. So you could build, for example, if you wanted to build your own custom construct, which we'll talk about that in a minute, it integrates in with like NPM if you're using JavaScript and TypeScript, and NuGet if you're using .NET, things like that. So those are the supported languages as of right now. So you'll need to have the CDK installed even if you're using another language. And so what we're going to do is we've got Node.js already installed. Here, I'm going to run that I want to install the CDK toolkit globally. Now, probably no surprise to you, I've actually already done that. So I'm going to cancel out of this, but I just wanted you to see that step was there. Notice here that we are in our infrastructure directory, and we're going to utilize here the CDK to create a new project here, in this case, based on TypeScript. So I'm going to do CDK init, and I'm going to tell it that I want to init an app, and I want it to be in TypeScript. Now you might be looking at this and going, well, what's this option that says generate only? The only reason I'm doing that is because I'm putting this in a Git repository that already exists. So in this case, I don't need to go through and have it create a Git repository for me and some of the other things that it does automatically, because it also does like npm install. We'll do that in just a second with Yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on this. And this will start the process of actually building out our application. So what I need to do next is I need to go back up here to my root directory. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and just run yarn. This will go through and install all of the dependencies. Now, while it's doing all of this, we're going to bounce over to VS Code because we don't need to sit around for all that. And I quickly just want to show you what we have here inside of this infrastructure directory. So there's several things that we have. First of all, I want to point out this cdk.json file. And if I open this up, one of the things I want you to see here is there's a bunch of settings that are included. Again, we're not trying to teach every single bit of the CDK on this episode, but you will notice here that under app, we're using TS Node, and it references this file bin/infrastructure.ts. So if I go here under bin and infrastructure.ts, this is basically the root file here for our CDK application. And an application is really kind of the root element we have here for a project within the CDK. Now we can have within that multiple what we call stacks, and then we can have constructs that exist inside of those stacks, and then we have resources. But this is where our app lives. And it's giving us some guidance here that we need to configure the environment for our stack, which just means in a lot of ways, we just need to tell it what we're talking about in terms of both the account and the region that we want to use. So in this case, I'm going to paste this in, and what this is going to do is it's just going to tell it basically, hey, use whatever account that my CLI is configured for, right? Which in this case, we're just going to use the default one. So in just a minute, I'm going to set my AWS profile for a specific account, and that's what it will use here. Now, in some cases, you'll want to be sure that you are explicit, because here's the dangerous thing about just using default account is if for some reason you're logged into another account, it will still deploy. But if you actually specify an account in a region, it'll obviously only deploy if you have permissions set in that specific account. But that's the first bit that we need to do here. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to go back over here to terminal. And within here, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to go ahead and just export my AWS profile. And I've got a specific profile that I use for this series called CBL. And so that's what I'm going to be using here. Now, we need to do something here called bootstrapping. This is actually a requirement when you're working with the CDK. This creates some resources within your AWS account that actually helps the CDK to work. It can't work without these things. So what we would do here is we would need to go in and say npx CDK bootstrap, and then we pass in this string. And this string really contains 2 bits of information. First is the account number, and the second is the region. So if you're using multiple regions, then you'll need to be sure that you run bootstrapping once per region. And if you want to do something crazy complicated like deploy from one region or one account into another account, and that's actually kind of how I have my production set up, there's some additional steps here, but we're not going to get deep into that today. Just know that before you can run a CDK deployment and have it work for any kind of deployments you need to be sure that you bootstrap first. Now, I also have already done this, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this. Now, the next thing that I want to be able to do is just to create something with the CDK. So I'm going to go back here to VS Code, and we're not going to mess around in this infrastructure.ts file right now. I'm going to go ahead and close it, but we're going to open up the file here under lib called infrastructure stack. Now, here, I'm going to delete some comments that are already in here. But this is where we would actually go in and create the infrastructure that we want to deploy. Now, you're probably wondering, what in the world does this look like? And that would be a fair question. What I'm going to do here is first, I'm going to need to import some additional packages here. So here you see AWS CDK lib. Now, most all of the resources for AWS, if you want to create something, you're going to import something from the AWS CDK lib. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule that we'll talk about and we'll actually demonstrate later. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to import S3. So this is in a package called AWS S3, and we're actually going to call that just S3 to make it a little easier to write out. And if I want to do something pretty simple, like just create a bucket, what I can do is I can go in here and just say, hey, I want to create a new S3.bucket. Now, with most things that we create within the CDK, we're going to pass in 3 different things. We're going to give it a reference to where we're creating it, which in this case is our infrastructure stack. So we're going to pass in this. Then we're going to give it a name. Now, this is not the name of the bucket, but this is the name of the resource that we're creating. Now, we could go through and give our bucket a name. That would actually be in this third option. And that's here that we can pass in properties. Now, in this case, I've just passed in one so you can see what it looks like. We have here that we're going to use just S3 managed encryption, but you could go through here and pass in basically whatever you wanted. Like if you wanted to do bucket name, like I mentioned, you could go through and enter your bucket name in here. You could do pretty much any property you can do on this. And if you want to, you could actually even dive in and say, okay, well, let me just go look at the code. I'm going to go in here to bucket, and I'm going to go look at this bucket props object. And here you can see everything that you can define. And I'll show you in just a minute that all of that information is included within the CDK documentation. So if you want to know all the specifics of how you would create a bucket, that's where you go. Now, I've got this saved, and I'm going to go now back over here to the terminal. And I'm going to run a command. I'm going to go ahead and go in to my infrastructure directory, and I'm going to run a command that is that we're going to run npx CDK synth. Now, here's what this is doing. I mentioned to you earlier that there is this service on AWS called CloudFormation. And CloudFormation is what really does the heavy lifting for infrastructure as code on AWS. Now, with this, CloudFormation handles things like taking a template and then knowing what resources to create, what resources to edit, and then ultimately what resources to delete. So it's what really does the work. Well, really all the CDK does is generate those templates, and we can see the templates that it actually generates by running this synth command. So here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go through and run this. So here, I'm just going to hit enter, and we're going to see after just a second, it's going to generate the YAML template that we would use for CloudFormation. And one of the things you'll see here is that it is just an S3 bucket, and it does have server-side encryption set. We're just using the AES 256 standard S3 managed encryption. You also can see there's a bunch of other options that are set here by default. And you can see the CDK has included a few additional parameters and the like as a part of this template. But this is really what it's doing. And if we wanted to then go through and deploy, we would actually go through and just run npx CDK deploy. Now, the first thing I should mention, though, is we can actually have multiple stacks. Now, we only have one here in this case. So if I run the command npx CDK list, it's going to tell us, hey, all you've got your infrastructure stacked. That's the whole bit. So one of the things that we can actually do here is we can actually go through and now say, well, since we only have one, I'm just going to say npx CDK deploy. Now, if we didn't have just one, if we had multiples, it would actually tell us, hey, you got to pick one. But in this case, we're just going to say npx CDK deploy. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run that. And I see we have a question here. Can we work as a stack mapping between regions? Okay, this is a great question. There are some constructs by default that enable you to work between regions, but what you would use in most cases is that you would actually have a stack per region that you want to work in. And I've actually set up a lot of different CDK projects using that way of doing things. And so if you need to share some references between it, there's different approaches you can take. And the specifics of how that works is really going to be dependent on your use case. But for example, AWS has built in some capabilities into the CDK to really help if you want to do something like, if you want to be able to go through and create, let's say, a deployment on CloudFront from another region. There's ways it can do that because some of those resources have to live in US East 1. So they try to make it easier where they can, but in most cases, you will need to have separate stacks for the different regions. But that is a great question. So this is what got us through deployment. We did all of this and we now have a bucket that has actually been created. And we could go in and we could look at it. It would, you would see it be a bucket. As a matter of fact, let's just do that really quick. So if I go in here to the bucket, I'm going to go pull up my AWS Management Console. I'm just going to reload real quick. And if I was to go in now under CloudFormation, if I can type, there we go. So if I go in under CloudFormation, I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see. You can see here that we do have our infrastructure stack. Now, there's a few things here that I've already deployed. We'll talk about what those are in just a minute. I've done that to save time. But you'll also notice down here at the bottom that we have CDK Toolkit. This is what gets created when we bootstrap. So we don't have to touch this again, but this is what's there to support the CDK. But if I go under my infrastructure stack and I go under resources, we can see here is our bucket. If I click on this, this is going to take us to our bucket within S3. And if I go under properties, you'll even notice, for example, hey, we've got this AWS S3 managed encryption, just like we configured it within the CDK. So we've actually gone through the whole process of deploying our first stack with the CDK. So again, obviously, as we go throughout this, let me know if you have any questions on how this works or how you would implement this for your application. But I'm going to go ahead and keep moving forward. We're going to go ahead and go back here, and we're going to do some things here to showcase some of the power of the CDK, specifically some of the things that would be difficult to do with just CloudFormation. So bear with me for just a minute. I'm going to go through and show you how to do some stuff, and I'm not going to explain every single bit along the way, but I want you to see kind of the sum of how some of this could work together. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through and give this particular resource a variable name. So we'll just say that we're going to call this our bucket. The next thing I want to do in here is that I want to bring in some more imports. So in this case, we're just going to bring in here Lambda Node.js. And this is a pretty cool construct that we can use that we actually will use later as we deploy our API. Now, the next thing I'm going to do from here is I'm going to also do another import. We're going to bring in just the path library. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a Lambda function. So I'm going to go here and say, hey, we're going to do a new Lambda function that's a Node.js function. And we're going to call this just, process and index.js. We're not really creating this yet. I'm just showing you this as an example. And so once we have that in place, I can now go through and I'm going to import one more thing. And then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to go ahead and say that we want to use this. I want to actually connect it so that this bucket triggers that Lambda function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say that we're going to add a new event source to this Lambda. And you can see here that we're using a helper method that exists on this construct that makes it easy for me to add an event source. And it's going to be our bucket, and we want this to fire every single time we have a new object that gets uploaded. Now, this is pretty cool. This might say, wow, that's pretty easy to define that, but we can take it further. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to create my own little construct. And again, a construct within the CDK is something that can have one or more resources inside of it. And it is in essence a reusable element. So I'm going to go in here inside of this. And what I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and just add an instance of this down here to the stack. So here's what I'm going to do. Give me just 1 second. So we're going to go down here. We've called this storage processing. I'm going to go down here in this case, and I'm going to remove this stuff, and I'm going to move it up here. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to go in here, and now I'm going to replace this and just say, hey, we're going to use a new instance of storage processing. And so the cool thing about it is we could actually then do this we could do this 3 or 4 or 5 times. I could create as many of these as we need, but I also can customize this construct. So in this case, we're going to go through and create a little properties object that we pass into our custom construct. So here, what we can say is that we're going to pass in the entry as a string, and we're going to pass in the events. Then what I can do is I can actually go through and say, well, when we create this construct, we're going to pass that in. So in this case, we'll say, hey, we're going to pass in our props. And then what this enables us to do is it enables us to go in and actually make this to where we can customize this every time that we use it. So we're going to go through here and we're going to say that we will pass in the props value here. And what we're going to do next is we're going to go through and we're going to then define this when we actually call our storage processing. So in this case, I'm going to go in and I am going to pass in both the entry and the events. And the cool thing is just by doing a little bit of work here, we've now created a pretty reusable construct that maybe in your organization, you could go through and say, hey, we want to be able to make it really easy to go through and create this reusable construct. And in a lot of ways, this helps to illustrate some of the reason why the CDK has been adopted so quickly and why it, for example, had a pretty big feature at AWS reInvent. And that's because organizations can identify the patterns that they want to use, and then they can create these constructs that they can use that really showcase the best practices that they want developers to implement. And you can do this for your own as well. And in just a minute, I'll show you that there's ways where you can even go through and share these constructs that you create with other developers. But I need to be honest with you because there are some people that kind of give the CDK a hard time, and I understand why. One of the reasons that they have a hard time with it is you can create these constructs that make it easy to deploy, but just because it's easy to deploy doesn't mean that you know everything that's in that construct and how to maintain it. So in some ways, this is a bit of the knock on the CDK, right? It can make some things so easy that you might deploy some infrastructure that you don't even know that you need to manage. So here, for example, we're using this one construct, but we're actually deploying an S3 bucket, a Lambda function, and a link between the two so that we can actually execute that Lambda function when we upload something new to our S3 bucket. So all this is just to say, even if you can deploy something easily, you still absolutely need to know how to maintain it. So I was just wanting to illustrate kind of the concept of how you could create these reusable constructs. Now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep moving. So we're not going to finish this construct out. I was just showing you this as an example. So let me go ahead and kind of reset this file here. So now we're back to having our basic web application. Now, I want to do something here. I want to showcase that we have something here called the Construct Hub. Now, this was created by AWS. This gives us the way to share CDK constructs. And you can go through and search for some, and you can see here that you can even search for which ones are supported in which languages, and you can go through and specify different criteria, right? If you want to do something like, something with EC2, for example, here you can see that there's one called, CDK EC2 key pair, and you can go through and see the documentation. You can get a link out to the repository. You can see how to use it. All of that's there. Now, I've created one that I actually used in one of my serverless paths on Pluralsight called CDK Web App Tools, and we're going to use this to handle a bit of our deployment. So I wanted to showcase here that you can actually see this particular construct, and we're going to use it both for the ability to create this config file that our React application can read, but also so that it will do the deployment for us, including building our web application as a part of our CDK deployment. So with all that said, let me go ahead and head back over here into VS Code. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file here. So I'm going to go here under lib, and we're going to say new file, and we're going to call this one hosting.ts. Now, what I want to do in here is I want to go through and I want to go ahead and set up a base construct, but we're going to need to install that construct that we just saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to say Yarn Workspace Infrastructure. That's the name of kind of our mini project within the mono repo infrastructure. And we're going to add CDK Web App Tools, which is the construct that we just saw. I'm going to go back here to VS Code, and now we're just going to create a base construct here. And so what we need to do now is we need to configure this so that we can actually deploy our web application. Well, the first thing that we're going to do in here is that we're going to go through and we're going to add in a bucket that's actually going to host our web application. And so we're wanting to build our React app and we want to push it here. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create what's called an Origin Access Identity, or OAI. Now, I realize some of this might be concepts you're not familiar with because these are all about deploying with CloudFront, and you might not have experience with CloudFront. Not a problem, but just understand how we're creating the resources, and then you can go into the CDK docs and learn about this more, how you do it in a bit. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a good amount here of kind of CloudFormation configuration. Now, this again, it's all about, not CloudFormation, CloudFront configuration. And this is really all about how we're configuring this content delivery network to deliver our React application. Now that we have that in place, you'll notice here that we do have a little bit of an error. Now, that's because what we need to do here is we need to go through and actually create a variable for this, which we'll do in just a bit. But what we need to do next is we need to go through here and we need to specify some of our own props. So here, I'm going to go here under Web App Props, and we're going to say here, what we're going to do here is we're going to go through and we're going to say that we need to pass in a relative web app path and a base directory. And this is what's going to give it a reference into our specific web application. Now, the last thing we need to do here is I'm going to go through and I'm going to say here that we're going to have a public read-only, and we're going to call this web distribution. That's what we're referencing down here. So we're going to say this is going to be a web distribution. And we'll actually set this type, in this case, is going to be CloudFront. And it's going to be our web distribution. So now that we have that in place, we can see that we've removed the errors that we had. And this is going to do some of the heavy lifting, but what we need it to do now is we need to actually build and then deploy our web application. So what I'm going to do here is underneath these, we're going to go through and say that we're going to use our CDK web app deployment. And we're going to go ahead and deploy out our web application. And here it's going to take care of building. It knows to run yarn build, and it knows where the actual build needs to end up. So perfect. So we've created a little hosting construct that we need to go back now, and we need to add into our stack. Now, the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually deploy this web app hosting, and we're going to need to import it, and then we're going to need to create an instance of our custom construct. So I'm going to go through here, and we're going to say that we want to create new web app hosting, and we're going to pass in those two props that we defined. And once we have this in place, if I were to actually now go in and save this, and then we were to go in and run CDK deploy, we actually would see how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and run the CDK deploy command. And it's going to start the process of going through this. Now, as I mentioned, it's actually going to be building our web application as a part of this. And you might say, well, why do we need to do that here? I know that I can just run yarn build. You'll see a bit later that we want everything to be integrated into our CDK deployment process so that when we implement continuous delivery, for example, all of that is integrated in as a part of one process. Now, This is going to deploy, and I'll be honest with you, it's going to take a minute or two. So we're going to go ahead and move back over into VS Code, and we're going to keep going, but we'll come back and take a look at this in just a minute. So now that I've defined this, what I want to do next is I want to create our Lambda function, because I want to show you that one of the things that the CDK can do really well at is helping us create our Lambda functions. So here, we're going to create a folder called services, and then here within services, we're going to create a file or another directory called inspect. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because we need to actually allow for multiple services. So here, I'm just creating one, but if you were creating your project, you would want to allow for multiple Lambdas. So here, the next thing we're going to do is create a new file, and we're going to call this just package.json, and we're going to put some values in here. And really, we only have one dependency we're worried about, and that is a dependency that can read metadata from images. Again, the specifics of this are not critical here. The next thing we're going to do is create a new file in here as well, and this is going to be index.js, and then we're going to go ahead and put some code in here that will do what we need it to do. And really, that's just two things. We're going to first get some metadata information about the image, and you can see that we're doing that here. And then we want to actually go to a service called AWS Rekognition and get some AI generated labels for our image. So it's going to use computer vision to look at the image and try to determine what's in the image and return those labels for us. So those are the two things that we're going to need to do. So what do we need to do now? Well, now we need to figure out how we're going to integrate this in to our infrastructure stack. So I'm going to go back here under our infrastructure directory. We're not going to touch our Lambda function anymore. And I'm going to go under infrastructure stack, and we're going to go in here, and we need to actually bring in some things so that we can actually use this service. The first thing that we need to do is I'm going to go up here, and we're going to actually do another import. We're going to bring in one called duration and AWS Lambda. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and we're going to create an instance of our Node.js function. Now, the specific properties that we're using for this are tied to the Lambda function, again, that we just created. So here, I want to show you how you can use a lot of different properties to configure a resource within the CDK. So here, first, you can see that we're using the Node.js 14 runtime. We're going to use the function named handler, and here you can see we're specifying the path. And again, this is just within our mono repo. We're able to define all of this together, our front end, back end, and infrastructure code. We're saying that for our particular Lambda function, we want it to have a 90-second timeout, and we want it to have 1024 for the memory size, which is quite a bit bigger than the default, but we might be looking at some big images. So we need to have that included as a part of it. Now, the next thing that we're going to need to do is we need to figure out how to actually expose this via API Gateway. And again, this is the managed API service for AWS. And we're specifically going to be using a type of API called HTTP API. So for this to work, we're going to need to bring in some additional packages. The reason is because some of these are not yet a part of AWS CDK lib. And this brings up an important point. When everything gets truly finalized in the CDK, like for example, the S3 package, that gets moved into AWS CDK lib. Now, before that gets finalized, they'll have some alpha or beta packages out there that you can install, but you have to install them separately. And the other thing I should mention here is that there are 3 different types of CDK constructs that you'll see the documentation refer to and you'll hear other developers talk about. First is the L1 construct, and these always have CFN as a prefix for CloudFormation. And the reason is because these are just raw constructs that map to the CloudFormation data types. An L2 construct is really still designed to create a single resource, but an L2 construct usually has some of the boilerplate stuff taken care of, and it might even have some utility methods that make it easier to work with that resource. For example, our Node.js function construct here is an L2 construct because it does some things for us just out of the box. Then we have L3 constructs. And L3 constructs, which the AWS documentation will also call, patterns, L3 constructs usually tie together multiple AWS resources into a common pattern. So the example that I created earlier, where we had a Lambda function paired with an S3 bucket and that event mapping between them, that was an L3 construct. So the reason I bring all of that up is because we're going to take a look here at integrating API Gateway, and we're going to use some constructs that aren't yet final and aren't in AWS CDK lib. Oh, now I should mention here that our previous deployment is still kind of underway here. I'm not going to deploy this yet. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel, but it actually reviews here all the stuff that needs to be created. So I'm going to go ahead for now, since we're making some changes, I'm going to cancel that. I actually meant to have that run. But what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and install some additional packages. So in this case, we're going to say yarn workspace infrastructure, and we're going to add in 2 new packages. AWS API Gateway v2 and AWS API Gateway v2 integrations. And these 2 together will help us actually build out API Gateway for our application. So I'm going to go ahead and install those. And the next thing we're going to do is go back over to VS Code, and we're going to create another file here in lib. And we're going to call this one api.ts. So here within this one, what we're going to do is we're going to go through first, we're going to do imports like we usually do. A lot of these should look a little common by now, but here you can see the bottom 2, we're actually bringing in some values from the new items that we just installed. Then we're going to create here our props, and we're going to pass in that Lambda function that we just created. Then we're going to actually create here our application API construct. And within here, what we're going to do is we're going to define the specifics of what we need. First, we're going to define that we want to have an API Gateway instance, and we need to configure all the specifics here. What's it going to be called? What headers are you going to allow? What origins are you going to allow? All those things. Then the next thing that you need to do after this is we need to add in our service. So we're going to take something that maps, again, our Lambda function in with our API Gateway. And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to then go in and create an output. Now, this here, if you remember, this is an L1 construct. Now, this is just a CloudFormation output. So this will just actually basically write this out as an output, which you can see either in the console or you can actually see it in the terminal when you actually deploy. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So this is going to be what we need to actually create our API. I'm going to go back here to infrastructure stack, and we need to go ahead and do an import. We're going to bring in our application API. Also here, I'm going to go in and import one other thing, and that is, oops, I'm sorry. Let me go ahead and do that in just a second here. We need to actually go in next, and we're going to add in a new instance. Let me do it in the right order here. A new instance of our application API, and we're passing in our inspect service. So this shows you how you can actually pass values in between different constructs. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually go through here and import IAM. Because if you noticed earlier, I mentioned that we were going to be using AWS recognition with our Lambda function. And here I want to show you what one of these helper functions looks like that you might use if you are using an L2 construct. And here you can see we have this function called add to role policy. And what this enables us to do is basically pass in this new IAM policy statement to give this Lambda function additional permissions beyond what it had previously. So that kind of gets us what we need there. So the next thing that we need to do here is we're going to need to pass this in to our web app hosting construct that we just created. So we're going to pass in our HTTP API, but we haven't done anything with it yet, so it's still going to have an error. So I'm going to go back here under hosting. And from here, what we're going to do is we are going to go through and actually include this as a prop that we need to bring in. And what we need to do now is also then to do an import to actually bring this in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here to my infrastructure stack. I'm sorry, I mean to our API. There we go. I'll get it in just a second. And then we're actually going to just copy this particular import, and we'll put it here under hosting. Now, the next thing that we need to do is I'm going to utilize another construct from the CDK web app tools, and that is called web app config. So here we're going to go in and we're going to pass this in. What this is going to enable us to do is actually to deploy a configuration file that our React application can use. So I've added all of this in, and now that we have this in place, we should be ready to integrate our application. Now I'm going to show you how this works together, and then I'm going to show you how you actually could continuously deploy this as, as a CDK stack all together. So what I want to do first is I want to go over here. We're just going to update this React application. So I'm going to go here under Web App. We're going to go under Source. And I want to show you that, first of all, if I go under here under public and index.html, we're actually pulling in a file off the root directory called config.js. So what that enables us to do here is go under our services file. And what we can do is that we can actually now pull that value in. And this will tell us what our endpoint is for our API. And then I can actually pass in 2 additional functions that will enable us to actually make a real implementation of this API. And so here, one of them is for getting file data, and one of them is for adding in our service call. And this actually uses that API endpoint. So if all of this works together, what we should be able to see is that we can actually go through and deploy this as one unit, and we actually can see that everything will know how to communicate one with another because it's all part of the same deployment process. So if you wanted to do that, it's just as before. We can run npx, cdk, and deploy. And what's going to happen here is it's going to go through the process of going through and actually creating this. Oh, I can see here that I've actually got one small error I need to fix real quick. Hold on one second. Okay, and so what happened here is I've actually defined HTTP API here as one of the props. And if I look down here, I actually don't have that brought in. So, yep. So what I want to show you now with this is I want to show you what happens when we actually utilize the power of constructs to take this even further. So I'm going to pull up here on CloudFormation. I mentioned to you earlier that I had done something ahead of time, and that is I had utilized a construct here called pipelines. So if we go here under API reference, this is the CDK documentation, and I go under pipelines, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to overview, and this will explain all of how you can utilize this pipelines construct to create a continuous delivery pipeline for your CDK stack. Now, a couple things I want to do. I want to answer a couple questions real quick, and then I want to show you what this looks like when you actually have this done. So with that being said, we can see here that, that there's a question about how long does it take for the CDK to finalize the resource that requires integration. So because the CDK uses CloudFormation, if you add in any dependencies, it'll work just like it would within a CloudFormation template. So what that means is that you can do things like say that one thing depends on another thing, and it will wait for that to be created before you can create it. You can even go a step further, and if you want to create things that exist outside of the AWS spectrum even, you can utilize something called, a CloudFormation custom resource and have it go do something else. It basically can execute a Lambda function and wait until that's complete before it goes and does something else. That's actually how I create that config file for the React application within that CDK construct. So again, not every resource is the same. We can create an S3 bucket in moments, but to create a CloudFront web distribution is going to take an extended period of time. So just again, something to watch out for there. You just need to know that it's going to be dependent on the resources that you can create. So here I created a pipeline stack. And again, here within the documentation, it's going to guide you through how you actually do that. But I want to show you what that looks like. So here, I'm going to go here under code pipeline. Now, this is a part of the developer services for the CDK. I'm sorry, for AWS in general. And code pipeline here enables us to configure these continuous delivery pipelines for our application. And here I have one that is connected to my GitHub account that enables me to be able to push out these web application to push out this web application every time I make a commit to that GitHub repository. Now, the way that works is I actually have a connection configured, and you have to do this before you can actually configure this inside of the CDK. So I've connected it to my GitHub account. Now from here, it's going to go through the process of getting the source and grabbing it from GitHub, building it, updating the pipeline if there are any changes, building all of those assets like my web application, and then ultimately deploying it out. And if I go take a look at this CloudFormation stack, I'll show you here that all of this has been completed. If I go to outputs, I'm going to be able to click here on this hosting URL, and you'll see here that this brings up our web application. And I'll make this bigger, and I'll actually show you this working end to end. So I'm going to go ahead and pull in an image, and we'll see here that it's going to be loading. And now we're actually able to pull in and see here that we have our photo, and we're actually pulling in real data this time, not just mock data. So with all that being said, when you look at the GitHub repository, and I'm getting ready to give you the link for that here in just a second, you'll have the ability to go through and see all of this completed. That's going to be under the finish branch. You can go through on the start branch and actually see, you can see kind of where things are at the beginning, and you can go through and see all the things that I have implemented here within this episode. So here you go with the actual GitHub repository. This is just a short link that'll get you there. And as always, you can feel free to add comments in there. You can feel free to add comments and questions and those kind of things. But I don't want you to forget that we do have a channel within Discord, within the ACG Discord, where you can go in and you can actually interact as you're building this yourself and just throw out any questions that you have, because again, I want to be able to help and assist as you work to learn the CDK. Now, before we wrap things up here, and I want to talk a little bit about the next episode, but before we wrap things up, what I want to do is I want you to, I want you to be able to ask any additional questions you have before we wrap things up. So go ahead and be piecing that together. But I want to let you know that for the next episode, we're going to be doing kind of what everybody has asked for. So as soon as we completed the first episode, I think there was a comment like almost immediately that, hey, can you do all of this same thing? Can you do that in Azure or something like it? So we're definitely going to be moving to Azure next. We're going to be doing some great things. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but here over the next week or two, you'll get the information about what we're going to be doing in Azure next month, and we'll be heading to GCP shortly thereafter. So again, the goal here is not for this just to be AWS centric, but if you're here and you say, well, I'm just AWS, trust me, I think there's value in learning how things are done in other platforms as well, because sometimes you might have job opportunities that might be in other cloud platforms. So I just want to call that out as something that you might want to consider, is making sure to stay tuned. Even if it's not in your primary platform, you'll be able to learn some things from that. Now, with that being said, before we wrap things up, are there any final questions? Or I'm also curious, are there any projects that you want to go out from today and use the CDK with? If so, I want to hear about it. I want to hear about the kind of things that you're going to be building. So go ahead and throw that in the comments. Okay, I'm seeing here that there's a comment that the repository link isn't working. Let me double check that real quick. Apologies if that's the case for you. Oh, I see what it is. Give me just 1 second here and we'll get that fixed. You can use this time to ask more questions. Okay, so please, if you get a chance, try the repository link again. Apologies, I believe that one was my fault, but it should be working for you now. Let me know if you have any trouble. So here I see that there is a question about, is the native AWS one better? Okay, and then also I see a question about drift detection. Great question. So first of all, with whether or not AWS native is better versus something like Jenkins, see, here's the thing. Here's my perspective on this at the end of the day. If you're setting up Jenkins, if you're setting up whatever build server you want to use, that's something else you have to manage and you have to maintain. One of the advantages of using code build along with code pipelines and then code deploy, if you're working with virtual machines or containers, you don't have to maintain those things. They're managed services that just work for you, and they all exist within the AWS environment that you have. So that to me is, in most cases, a better approach. Now, if you work for an organization that says, nope, we're going to use this one build server, great. You can make it work with that. Absolutely. But I find a ton of value in using what's integrated with AWS directly because it's less to maintain. In most cases, again, you also can pay less because you're going to be using resources only when you need it. It works in an on-demand capacity. But again, you can try it for the other. That's totally fine. The other thing here that somebody asks is, what about drift detection? So yes, you do have drift detection within CloudFormation. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to really quickly move over back here to my browser. So give me just 1 second. If you go into CloudFormation, so here I'm just going to go to CloudFormation. We'll let this load up here. I can go into any of my stacks. Like, let me go here under my infrastructure stack, right? And I've got the ability to go see the resources and actually do drift detection, such as here with view drift results. Now, again, I don't have, nothing will have drifted here. So with that being said, it's not going to be something that, that it's going to show anything. But if I were to go through, it's going to tell me, hey, here, this is in sync. So you do have support for drift detection with CloudFormation. That was something that was, that's been added several years ago. It's been an essential piece for me ever since. But that is a great question, because that is one feature that once you have, you do not want to live without, because you want to make sure somebody doesn't go in and change that. The next question that I see is, how do I make learning AWS CloudFormation fun? Oh gosh. Okay. So I think the fun of infrastructure as code is what you can build with it. And that for me is one of the great things about the CDK, is that it can make it a little easier, because here's why. When you're working either within a YAML template or JSON and you're trying to build your CloudFormation templates directly, sometimes you're going to have to spend a ton of time in the docs. And when you get the great, code sense capabilities, when you're working within like TypeScript, for example, or .NET or Java, and it knows about everything that's there, to me, I actually create things quicker. And creating those reusable constructs to me is actually super fun, because I have a bunch of reusable constructs that I use across the different projects that I create. So for me, that makes it a lot more fun than just creating plain YAML or JSON templates. But again, jump on the Discord channel and let me know how you're doing with that. If you're struggling with that, we'll try to provide some assistance if we can, so that you can get in and get some experience with that. But that is, again, I think that's a great question. Perfect. Well, I believe I don't see any additional questions coming through. I appreciate everybody joining us today here for Cloud Builder Live. Actually, I see one more question come through that I'll tackle right here at the end. Do I recommend starting with infrastructure as code from scratch? I mean, I don't think it should be the first thing you do. No, I think if you're going to go through and build something, hey, feel free to use the console. Just test some things out. But before you build anything for real, before you get too serious, you should definitely spend some time working within infrastructure as code. That is a great question. So I appreciate that. So again, thanks for joining us today for Cloud Builder Live. Again, we're going to be jumping into Azure next, so I hope you're excited about that. I know I am, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys next month here on Cloud Builder Live.